Welcome back to Duhan RV, where every twist hurts a little deeper. Wherever you're watching from, maybe it's late at night, maybe you're hiding in the bathroom for peace, thank you for being here. What time is it where you are? Let us know below. This channel is built on real emotions and real people like you. So take a breath, hold tight, because today's story might leave you trembling. The sun was burning down on the old roof when a new guest arrived. A man with a quiet smile and history with Duhan was back not just to say hello, but to help rebuild her home. The same man who once asked Duhan if she'd be his girlfriend now showed up with tools in hand. There's kindness in his eyes, but also something unreadable. Is this chance or a new chapter? There were no words between them, just glances and the weight of everything unsaid. Duhan wanted to believe this man had changed, that his presence meant something more. But a voice inside her whispered, "Be careful." She had been burned before. Still, she couldn't help noticing the way he moved, the care he put into every nail, every board. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes with silent labor. The question lingered in her mind, why is he really here? No one helps this much without a reason. Was it guilt, love, or something else entirely? The tension was silent but sharp. Every time their eyes met, she felt herself drifting closer and pulling away at the same time. Her heart wanted peace, but her mind demanded truth. And the truth, she feared, might be darker than hope allowed. If you've ever questioned someone's return in your life, hit that like button. Help us tell more stories like Duhan's by subscribing to Duhan RV. And don't forget to tap the bell icon. You don't want to miss the moment the truth finally breaks through. Every view, every comment keeps this journey going. So tell us, what do you think he's really hiding? She had built walls around her heart, layer by layer, after every betrayal. But now, those walls trembled. His presence was soft, almost healing, yet dangerous in its tenderness. What if this kindness ended the same way, with silence, departure, and more heartbreak? Duhan kept busy, hiding her thoughts behind chores and small talk. She didn't want to fall for hope again. Not unless she knew it would stay. Mrs. Ho smiled warmly, her eyes shifting between Duhan and the man beside her. She praised their chemistry, saying fate must have brought them together. Duhan politely bowed her head, lips curled in a faint smile, but her mind was miles away. Was this really fate or just another path chosen for her by someone else? She couldn't tell if the kindness was genuine or arranged. The words lingered like echoes in her chest. The man didn't say much. He nodded, smiled, but his eyes darted away when Duhan looked at him. There was something unsettled about him, like he was rehearsing a role he didn't want to play. Duhan noticed the tension in his posture. She wondered if he truly liked her, or if this was just another favor he was doing for someone he couldn't say no to. The compliments were sweet, but too perfectly timed, too conveniently placed. Her heart beat faster, not from joy, but from the suspicion that maybe this had all been planned. Had someone decided she needed saving again? Was this another mask hiding something darker beneath? She glanced at the man again. He looked away, fidgeting slightly. That small gesture spoke volumes. Maybe he had secrets too. Maybe she wasn't the only one living a life layered with silence. The thought didn't comfort her. It only added to the weight pressing on her chest. Who here was really honest? Duhan stood there, barely breathing. Bieho's voice was still echoing somewhere behind her, but none of it registered. All she could hear was the silence between her and the man across the table. A silence so loud it choked her. Was she just another chapter in someone else's story again? Or worse, just a replacement for someone he truly loved? The sound of wood splitting echoed in the quiet yard as he drove the axe into each plank. Duhan watched from a distance, her thoughts tangled. He looked focused, hands steady, as if building something more than a fence. Maybe stability. Maybe trust. She didn't dare ask what it all meant. But something in her chest ached, a strange mix of hope and caution. With sweat on his brow and dust on his sleeves, he measured each wooden stake with care. Duhan came closer without realizing. Watching him work made her heart throb in places long asleep. He smiled up at her, unaware of the storm he stirred inside. This man, was he really here to stay? Or would he vanish like all the rest? Every strike of the hammer echoed with unspoken questions. She wanted to ask why he cared, why he showed up now, why he worked like this place was his own, but her lips stayed sealed. Sometimes silence holds more weight than words, and right now, all she could do was stand beside him and feel everything. The fence began to take shape, but Duhan's feelings only grew messier. Was she ready to let someone in again? Was kindness always followed by heartbreak? She didn't know the answers. But as she handed him a piece of wood, their fingers brushed, a small spark, brief, but enough to make her pause and breathe a little deeper. They sat under the eaves, shaping wooden stakes into sharp points. One by one, the dull ends transformed under their hands. Duhan held the knife a bit clumsily, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he showed her gently, guiding her grip. Time slowed down with each finished stake. They were building more than a fence. They were carving out a space of quiet trust. The pile of raw wood slowly turned into a neat row of sharpened stakes. They didn't rush. Every now and then, their fingers brushed, but neither pulled away. The sun filtered through the trees, painting soft shadows across their arms. This wasn't work anymore. It was something delicate and spoken. Duhan felt safe, even as the knife glinted under sunlight. He handed her another piece of wood, their eyes meeting for a moment longer than needed. She took it, nodding, then focused on the task. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was warm, comfortable. He glanced sideways, watching her work, a quiet admiration in his gaze. Each shaved edge, each smooth point, felt like a quiet promise being made. Duhan stepped outside with a quiet breath, her sandals crunching softly on the dirt path. Trin walked beside her, each holding a hoe in hand. The garden stretched ahead, filled with dry soil and stubborn weeds. Without a word, they each took a corner. A sense of quiet purpose hung in the air, as if they both knew this moment mattered more than it seemed. The sun cast a golden glow over the small plot as they worked. Duhan struck the ground with steady rhythm, while Trin, though not as strong, tried to match her pace. Neither spoke, yet something passed between them, a strange blend of determination and silent camaraderie. Sweat beaded on their brows, but they kept going, eyes fixed on the soil that resisted every strike. From time to time, Duhan paused, wiping her forehead and glancing at Trin, who now hummed a quiet tune while working. The tension between them had softened, replaced by something almost comforting, as birds chirped above and leaves rustled faintly. The simple act of digging became a quiet dance of effort and understanding to people, both carrying stories, sharing this peaceful labor. A light breeze swept through the garden, cooling their flushed faces. Duhan looked up briefly, catching a glimpse of Trin smiling at the earth. She didn't fully understand him, but for now, that didn't matter. What mattered was the soil turning beneath their feet, the weeds giving way, and the odd comfort of shared effort. Perhaps healing began in small, quiet moments like this. From the veranda, Mrs. Ho stood still with a hand on her heart. She had come out to call them for a drink, but paused when she saw the scene unfolding. Duhan and Trin, heads down, sleeves rolled, were working in unison. Something about their quiet focus made her smile. It wasn't just hard work, it was harmony. She whispered softly to herself, perhaps this was what fate looked like. She took a step closer, watching how Duhan adjusted her grip on the hoe, how Trin gently cleared a stubborn root. There was care in their movements, not just in the soil, but in how they mirrored each other. Mrs. Hoa had seen many kinds of bonds in her life, but this one intrigued her. Perhaps not love, but something delicate was forming. And she felt oddly hopeful. As the afternoon sun filtered through the trees, Mrs. Ho walked back inside quietly, lost in thought. She didn't want to disturb the rhythm outside. In her heart, she began to weave a future, a scene of companionship and laughter that had long eluded Duhan. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something right. But she knew better than to rush what needed time. Outside, Trin glanced sideways at Duhan and gave a small smile. She didn't notice, still focused on digging. For a moment, He looked down at the dirt and sighed. This wasn't just about helping, it was something else, something even he couldn't define. He had told her the truth once, and yet, the feeling in his chest now was something entirely new and unfamiliar. Duhan finally paused, brushing hair from her face and looking up. She caught Trin staring but said nothing. Instead, she offered him a small bottle of water. Their fingers brushed, just slightly. The contact meant nothing, or maybe it meant everything. She pulled away quickly, pretending not to notice the glance that lingered on her a moment longer than it should have. The silence between them returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It was denser, loaded with things unspoken. The soil had been turned, the weeds cleared, but what had shifted in their hearts remained unclear. Above them, a bird took flight, wings catching the wind. Sometimes, silence carried more than words ever could. And both of them felt it, even if they couldn't name it. The phone rang just as Mrs. Ho was folding the kitchen towels. She picked up, her voice calm but curious. It was the venue manager from the wedding hall she had contacted weeks ago. Her eyes lit up. Though she hadn't confirmed a couple yet, in her heart, she had someone in mind. Someone gentle, brave, and kind. She looked out the window again, and whispered softly, "Duhan." Mrs. Ho paced slowly across the room, holding the phone tightly. She listened to the suggestions on floral themes, table arrangements, and gifts for the bride. But her mind wandered elsewhere. What would Duhan like? Something simple, here. A white dress, maybe. Or a garden ceremony. Her heart warmed at the thought. She didn't just want a daughter-in-law. She wanted Duhan to feel chosen, treasured. Before hanging up, Mrs. Hoa confirmed one small detail: she wanted the gift to be a surprise. A handcrafted item, something meaningful, not expensive but lasting. As she ended the call, she walked over to the window. Duhan was still in the garden. Mrs. Hoa watched her for a while, a quiet smile forming. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally building the family she'd always dreamed of. The sun cast soft shadows as Duhan and Trin continued clearing the weeds. Their hands moved steadily, rhythmically. Though little words were exchanged, the silence between them was not cold. It was the kind of quiet shared by people focused on a common task. The scent of warm earth rose with every dig. A small breeze passed by, lifting a few leaves. In that moment, it almost felt like healing. Duhan wiped her forehead with her sleeve, then glanced over at Trin. They worked side by side, not needing to explain anything. The small plot of earth began to take shape. Rows of clean soil emerged. Duhan felt a tiny flicker of peace. Maybe, just maybe, she was building something again, from the ground up. Inside the house, Mrs. Hoa adjusted her purse and put on her hat. She paused briefly at the doorway, watching the two figures bent in the garden. Her eyes softened. There was something beautiful about seeing two young people working so earnestly. She stepped out, clearing her throat gently. Trin and Duhan both looked up. "I'll head out for a bit," she smiled. "You to take care of each other." Mrs. Ho walked down the path slowly, letting her thoughts drift. The excitement bubbled inside her, though she kept it hidden beneath her calm steps. Today wasn't just about checking a venue. It was about preparing something lasting, something hopeful. She didn't want to rush anything, but she believed in small signs. And watching Duhan earlier, she couldn't help but wonder if fate was already working its quiet magic. Duhan stood beside Trin, watching Mrs. Hoa's figure disappear down the path. She didn't say a word, but her fingers clutched the hem of her shirt. There was something about the way Mrs. Hoa smiled that left an ache in her chest. Was it hope or pressure? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that kindness sometimes carried silent expectations. And she didn't know if she was ready to meet them. Trin's gaze followed the same direction, but his thoughts were far more chaotic. He wasn't worried about Mrs. Hoa's expectations, he was worried about his own secrets. Every day spent here felt like walking a tightrope. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but pretending became heavier. The truth was still locked inside. He inhaled sharply, forcing a smile. "Let's finish the weeds," he said, trying to anchor himself back to the moment. The sun moved higher, casting longer shadows on the ground. Both Duhan and Trin remained still for a moment longer before picking up their tools again. They didn't speak of what they felt. In this silence, there was understanding, but also distance. To people, standing side by side, yet each trapped in their own maze. And as the breeze stirred the leaves again, the day marched quietly on. Just as peace began to take root, destiny intervened. Mrs. Ho stopped in her tracks. At the gate stood Dan, the kind man who once held Duhan's heart with quiet strength. His return was unexpected, his eyes searching for something lost. What brought him back? What did this mean for the life Duhan was rebuilding? The moment felt heavy with questions, each one louder than the last. Mrs. Ho's heart pounded as she greeted Dan, her eyes wide with emotion. "You came back," she whispered. Dan gave a quiet nod. No storm in his tone, no drama in his step, only a man returning to where part of his heart still lived. For Duhan, his return could be a miracle or a test. One thing was certain, nothing would remain the same after this moment. What happens when the past walks through your front gate with the calmest smile? Will Duhan choose the future she's building, or the one that never truly ended? You won't want to miss what's next. If this story kept your heart racing, hit like, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe to Duhan RV. More secrets, more emotions, and more truth are waiting in the next episode.